Morning. Thank you very much, Steve. I certainly appreciate that. I told Brother Taylor that I have never done anything like this, and so I better get my watch out first. He told me I had as much time as I needed, but my wife told me I didn't. She's my timekeeper. Let me take you back to an early morning in Memphis, Tennessee. There were three other agents and I who had approached a house that morning in which we believed a federal fugitive was staying. And I believe that the house belonged to a female relative of his. I can't remember at this point if it was his mother, grandmother. But in any case, the reason for the early morning is we learned through experience that most fugitives don't get up early, and we did. And as we approached the house, as we normally do, two agents went to the back door. The other two of us went to the front door, and I happened to be the one that was assigned to do what we call the knock and announce. And so I knocked on the door, FBI, we have a arrest warrant for whoever the guy was, I don't remember his name. And I said, open the door. No response. Waited about 10 seconds. Knocked louder, announced again, louder. And that time I was able to look through a little window in the door, and I saw this woman walking down a hallway that was perpendicular to the entry hallway. She was actually kind of sneaking down the hallway. She was in a robe. And so when I saw that there was someone there, I pounded on the door. I said, FBI, either open up now or we're kicking the door in. I waited 10 seconds and no response, and so I stepped back and planted a firm kick right next to the doorknob. Normally when you do that, by the way, experience had shown that the door would just break the frame at the lock and open up. Didn't do that time. As a matter of fact, what it did is the whole door fell inward. Everything fell just right down. There was nothing there. And I was startled, but I rushed in, and obviously I'm standing on the door, and I realized it's not level, it's wobbly. And I looked down to see what was causing it to wobble, and all I could see were two hands and two arms sticking out from under that door. And I realized that little lady I had seen had started to the door just as I kicked it in. And I was standing on the door on her. Well, being a gentleman, I got the door off of her. She was not hurt, but I told her who we were there for. And by the way, just as I was standing on her, the agents at the back had heard this commotion, and they kicked the back door in. And she said the person we were looking for was not there. She had not seen him in quite some time. In those days, a federal warrant was also a search warrant. So we searched the house, and to nobody's surprise, we found him. He was hiding in the attic between rafters. She had felt very comfortable lying to us. And I thought, for a brief moment, as I was standing on that door, on that little lady, how did a nice little guy from Blytheville, Arkansas, end up here standing on a door on this little lady? And that's the story I will try to tell you today. They say that 20/20 hindsight is much better than when you're going through experiences, and I believe that. And so I want to emphasize as I start, as I mentioned to Brother Glenn this week, this is not my story. I'm telling it from my perspective because I have no other perspective to give. But it's really the story of God's faithfulness to me. And I have seen in 20/20 hindsight that He has always been there. He's always been there, guiding me, pushing me, leading me to places that I didn't want to go sometimes and that I never expected to go. But I guess that's why I have always felt a strong sense of love for a verse that one of our pastors really emphasized a number of years ago. And that's Jeremiah 33:3. It says, call to me and I will answer you and I will tell you or show you great and mighty things that you don't know. And God has done that for me. He has caused me to experience things that a little boy from Blytheville, Arkansas never imagined experiencing. And the most amazing part of it is that my story started early. His faithfulness started to me when my family and I moved to Blytheville from another small town nearby, and I met a little girl. And she was in church, same church that we went to, and she became a good friend of mine. And after being friends for a couple of years, we realized it was more than friendship. And so I started dating this wonderful woman when she was a freshman in high school and I was a sophomore. By the way, young people, that's much too young to start dating. Don't ever do it. But it happened to work out for us because after dating for 7.5 years, we've now been married 52. God has blessed me. Well, after college, I went into I worked for 1.5 years, but then Vietnam came along, and so I joined the Navy and went into officer candidate school, spent 4.5 years in the Navy. And there it was that I really started experiencing God's faithfulness and oversight in my life in a way that really became evident. That's because after spending a deployment to Vietnam on the Enterprise with my aviation squadron, came back to Albany, Georgia, or if you know that area, it's Albany, not Albany. And I spent 2 years there heading up a training division, training officers and enlisted men in operational intelligence. And it came time after my 4 years in the Navy to either decide, do I stay in the Navy or do I get out and go back to my job? And it was a very tough decision. June and I labored over it for months, literally months. I was working with my detailer in Washington, D.C., and I wanted to go to a billet in the state of Washington because June and I had been married 7.5 years and couldn't have a child. And so we had decided to adopt. And I knew that if I went to the billet in Washington State, we could continue our adoption process. But my detailer wanted to send me back into Vietnam as a riverboat commander. And that would mean our adoption proceedings would be placed on hold for 1 year. But after a lot of prayer and really decision-making, June and I decided that we liked the Navy, and so I would stay in. And I had to have my commanding officer sign some paperwork to augment from the into the regular Navy from the reserves. And so I filled out the paperwork, went across the street to his office, and was waiting in his outer office for him to sign the paperwork that would keep me in the Navy. And another officer I worked with walked down the hallway and saw me and literally backed up and stuck his head around the door and said, "You should have been here a moment ago. There was an agent from the Naval Investigative Service here, and he said the FBI is hiring 1,000 new agents." And it sounds like something you would be interested in, and I know you've been trying to decide what to do. And because I was so interested in the FBI, my first thoughtful and probing question was, did he say how much it paid? That's because I was 28 years old. And at that ancient age, I was making $10,000 a year as a lieutenant in the Navy, and I didn't want to take a cut in pay. And he said, I believe he said that they start at $10,000 a year. Well, that was a clue to me. And I thought, I should look into this. So I put my paperwork back in my pocket, went back to my office, looked in the front of the phone book for the number of the FBI, and called the local FBI office. Talked to the agent there, and he said, "Why don't you come down on your lunch hour and we can talk some more?" So I did that. And he gave me an application and background information about the FBI. I'd never even considered the FBI. I didn't know an FBI agent, never thought about it. I majored in math and minored in physics. I didn't know anything about law enforcement. Really never cared anything about law enforcement. And I went home that night, and June and I talked about it, and she had some questions that I had not thought about. Like, is it dangerous? And where will we go? What's the transfer policy? Things of that sort. So I called him back the next morning and I asked, is it dangerous? And he said, no. He said, when FBI agents arrest, we go in teams. It's not a traffic stop. And he said, in 25 years, I've never had anybody draw a gun on me, and I've only had to draw mine once. I thought, well, this is a piece of cake. And so I called my Navy detailer and told him I was leaving the Navy. Of course, when I did that, he said, well, I could give you that billet in the state of Washington. And I said, no, I've made my mind up. And folks, I had a peace about that decision. It was like I had never considered the FBI, but it was like God's hand was saying, this is where I want you. I didn't know that I had to take a test to get in the FBI. And so June and I drove to Atlanta, Georgia, and I took the hardest test I've ever taken in my life. And I had taken a graduate record exam that I thought was hard. This was harder. And I remember walking out of that test, met June on the street there in Atlanta, and I said, we really messed up because I just failed that test, and I've already told the Navy, forget it. I won't have a job now. Well, I passed the test, and I got my appointment letter to the FBI, and I entered on duty at new agents class on February the 17th, 1971. Well, I trained for 3 months, and most of the training was legal type stuff, some law, some just learning the various statutes. At that time, the FBI was responsible for some 270 federal laws that we investigated, including important things like Unsafe Refrigerator Act, Smokey the Bear Act, Migratory Bird Act, but also bank robberies and car thefts and interstate thefts. And we also had training, physical training and firearms training. And I remember that part of the physical training was what we call defensive tactics, and that was teaching us how to take some man down if we were actually in hand-to-hand combat with him. And part of that was teaching us how to take a gun away from a guy if he had a gun drawn on us. Now that one, folks, blew my mind because I thought, I will never put myself in this situation. That's why I've got a gun. I don't allow somebody to draw one on me. And I hated that because I thought it was so stupid to be teaching us that. Keep that in mind. I'll get back to that later. We arrived in my first office, Miami, Florida, on August the 16th, 1971, and I was assigned to a squad that primarily worked fugitives, which was, Miami is a target-rich opportunity for fugitives. They all go there. And as a baby agent, I was assigned to an older, experienced agent for a month, and he taught me the ropes of how to live on the street. And while we were in that month period, we were living in an efficiency motel while we were looking for a house. And June started calling adoption agencies. And after 3 weeks, she had called every adoption agency in the phone book and was rejected by all. And I was lamenting this to the agent that was training me. And he said, well, have you checked with the Catholic Service Bureau? And I said, I'm not Catholic. And he said, you don't have to be. He said, I know an agent that was here for a year, and he adopted 2 children from the Catholic Service Bureau, and he was not a Catholic. He said, I know the priest that heads that up. Let's go over. He was a Catholic, by the way. Let's go over and talk to him. So we drove over to the adoption agency, and the priest wasn't there, nor was the woman who was in charge, but her assistant gave me an application and some information. And I went home, and for the first time in about 2 years, we had a glimmer of hope because it seemed like that it might actually work. And so I called the woman in charge the next day, and she apologized to me. She said, my assistant shouldn't have given you anything because I understand you're only here for a year, which was true. In those days, our first assignment was always exactly 1 year. And she said, the minimum time for an adoption is 18 months. And so there's no possibility. Well, I asked her if she would let me come talk to her. And so she did. And I poured out my heart to her about what we had gone through to try to have a child. And she said, well, I tell you what, go ahead and fill out the application, and we can put it on file, and when you get transferred, we'll transfer it to the Catholic Service Bureau wherever you go. I said, thank you. That's hope. That's hope. And so we did that, and I turned it in. And within a week after I turned it in, she called and she said, to speed things up, we've decided to go ahead and process your application. And they did that, including interviewing June and me separately and together and checking our references, contacting the references. And then she called and she said, we're going to go ahead and do physicals too. And I told her, you know, I'm a baby agent, but I didn't just fall off of a turnip truck. I said, you know, the truth is, in a year I could be dead. So why would a physical be necessary now? And she said, would you just get the physical? And that was a clue. I said, okay, we will. So we got our physicals, and within a couple of weeks after that, June got a call one Friday, and the woman said, do you have any baby stuff? And we told her, no, we did have, but it had been laying around and it was just a source of anguish to see it, so we sold it. And she said, how soon could you get stuff together? And June said, we'll get it over the weekend, which we did. And she called back on Monday, and June said, we got everything that we think we need. And the woman said, I'll call you on Wednesday. On Wednesday, she called and she said, why don't you come over here? So that was before cell phones, and June had to work through the radio room at work, and they called me, and so I went home, picked her up. And we got our daughter. She was 11 days old. And 6 months later, we finalized the adoption. And I asked the woman, what happened? There was no hope, and all of a sudden it's like rush, rush, rush. And she said, well, normally we have a long list of girls who are going to adopt out their children through us but don't want it raised Catholic. And normally we have a long list of people who want to adopt a child but don't want to raise it Catholic. And she said, when you came in, we didn't have either. No girls, nobody on the list. And she said, 2 days after you turned the application in, a girl came in, she was 8 months pregnant, and she said, I want to give my baby up for adoption, but I don't want it raised Catholic. And the woman said it frightened her, because she said, I believe that God conceived that child for you and your wife. And we had to rush. We arrived in Miami on August the 16th. We picked up our daughter November the 17th, 3 months, in what had been a minimum of a year and a half. Now, why do I tell you that? I tell you that because, in retrospect, I realize that God used the United States Navy, and He used an officer who happened to stop by and see me when I was about to stay in the Navy. And then He used the FBI to move me to the one place that my daughter would be. He used Nebuchadnezzar to punish Israel. He used the government to bless us and to bring glory to Himself. Well, during this time, I was still working, and I was working fugitives. And we had a fugitive that we were looking for And we had information that he was going to make a call one night. We knew what number that was going to be called, and so there were 4 of us that were on the downtown streets of Miami waiting for that call to be made because the telephone company was going to tell us where it was made from. It was supposed to be made at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. It wasn't. It was made at 4 o'clock on Saturday morning, just about the time we were going to give up. And we found the guy in a phone booth where the telephone company said he would be. My partner and I pulled down and stopped and got out of the car, and the other 2 agents parked across a parking lot from where he was standing. He came out of the phone booth after a few minutes and started toward us and obviously made us as law enforcement. We didn't know why, but we found out later on that the doorway in which we were standing happened to be a gay bar, and we didn't look the part. Just saying. And so he turned and started walking away from us. And we started following him, and as he got to the parking lot next to this building, he broke into a run out through the parking lot. We started running after him, and the 2 agents from the other way started running at him. And after about 50 yards, he stopped, and he reached in his hip pocket. He was wearing jeans. He reached in his hip pocket, turned around, and came out with a gun. And all I could do is yell, "Gun," and go to my training that I hated so much. I immediately saw it was a snub-nosed revolver. I learned that when you're confronted with that, you grab the cylinder because then he can't pull the trigger. You shove it into the guy, and you break it against his thumb, and theoretically, if that works, you will be able to take the gun away from him. And it worked. And I thought to myself, it works. Then I realized this is not training, so I had to go on, and I got my handcuffs out. By that time, my partner had his gun out. We handcuffed him and took him to jail. And I thought to myself, isn't it something that God sent me through that training that I hated so much? And I thought about the 121st Psalm. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. God is so good. He's been so faithful to me. Well, we got transferred to Memphis after 1 year, sure enough. Exactly 1 year. That was significant because I was born in Memphis. We grew up 50 miles from there. The Bureau never transfers you back to where you're from. They did it because they thought I was from Atlanta, where I had come in from. And so we spent 7.5 years in which we adopted another daughter, this one through the Baptist Children's Home in Memphis. But more importantly, our girls got to know their grandparents for the only time, because after that 7.5 years, we were not around them anymore. But they got to know their grandparents. And one of the things that happened to me, I worked bank robberies a lot. And I got so accustomed to good people lying to me that I hated it. I just hated to have people lie to me. And it was so bad that I would start every interview with a subject by saying this. After I gave them the Miranda warning, I said, from this point on, you can do one of 3 things. You can either tell me the truth, you can tell me a lie, or you can tell me I'm not going to talk to you. And 2 of those are okay. The one you shouldn't do is lie to me, because if you lie to me, I promise you, I will get you. And I came up with ways to show people that I knew they were lying. One guy I was interviewing for a bank robbery, he had been arrested on a local charge and was in jail, so I went to jail to interview him. And he was sitting at it was in an attorney's room, he was sitting at a table across from me, and I gave him his Miranda warning. He said he will talk to me. He said, I don't know anything about a bank robbery, so I'll talk to you. And I started interviewing him, and he could see my notes. I would ask him a question, and I would write down what he said. And occasionally, out beside what I wrote, I'd put a big asterisk. And he didn't say anything about it. After about a page and a half of notes, he stopped me. He said, "What are you making those stars for?" I said, "Oh, the stars are so that I remember which are your lies and which is the truth. And those are the lies that you're telling me." He said, "I'm not lying to you." I said, "Yeah, you are. And I'm marking it so when I write my report, I can say, he said this, but it was a lie." He said, "Well, I'm not lying." I said, "Well, let's go ahead and finish the interview." After about another page of notes, he stopped me. He said, "Look, if you'll stop making those stars, I'll tell you the truth." And I said, "Okay." He said, "What are you going to do about those stars?" And I said, "Well, I have to put down what you said, but I can put that at this point in the interview, he started telling me the truth." He said, "If you'll just do that." And you know, I got to thinking about, if that bothered me that much, imagine how God feels. Because what made me so mad is the people who thought they could lie to me were saying, "You're stupid. You don't know anything." Imagine how God feels when we lie to him. I don't know what Sunday school curriculum you're in, but we're in Explore the Bible, and last week it was in Acts 5, talking about Ananias and Sapphira. They came in and left their gift, but kept back a part of it. And we know what happened to them. And I was reading one commentator that said, if God dealt with sin in the church and lying in the church today the way he did then, every church would have to have a funeral home in the basement. And the only reason God doesn't still deal like that is because of his mercy. He's a merciful God. Well, after 7.5 years in Memphis, the Bureau in its wisdom saw fit to move us to Chicago, away from our family, away from everything we knew. We spent 12 wonderful, no, I can't say wonderful. We spent 12 years, which seemed like 50 in Chicago. But you know, what I worked up there was corruption. Corruption. A target-rich area. Because police, elected officials, appointed officials, anybody you wanted to look at, they were like a target. It was a culture of corruption. I want to tell you one brief story. We had a case on the court system. And the Department of Justice said, you can't pay off corrupt judges using real people, because if you get them off and they're guilty, we look bad. And if you don't get them off and they're not guilty, we look bad. So the only way they'd let us work that case is for FBI agents to pose as, to go out and get arrested and go through the court system and pay off the corrupt judges. And so we did that for several years. I was assigned to try to get arrested for a DUI violation. And I thought this will be an Academy Award performance because I don't drink and I'd never been drunk. And I had to convince Chicago police officers that I was. So on a Friday night, I got a little cup of whiskey and I set it on the console, and out I go looking for a place to get arrested. And I was out on an expressway and passed by this Chicago police car sitting on the side, and I speeded up and started swerving. They just let me go. So I went up to the next exit and got off and came back and got in behind them again. And as I came by them that time, they had somebody stopped, and I thought, what in the world could that person have done that I haven't done? And so I went up, did the same thing, got in behind them again. Third time, as I got past them, I speeded up, swerved across 2 lanes of traffic, and they lit me up, pulled me over. It's a long story, but it was hard getting arrested, because they started out saying, you know, if you have $50, you can pay your fine here and we'll let you go. We knew that was going to happen, so we never carried money with us. We were not interested in paying off the police officers. We wanted to get to the judges. And it went from 50 to 35 to 25. Finally, they said, we're going to have to arrest you. And as we were going in the precinct, one of them put his hand on the door and said, if you have $15, you'll save us from having to write up a report, and we'll let you go. And I just told him, do your job. And so at 1:30 on a Saturday morning, I was locked up. And it was only then that I realized, nobody who knows me knows where I am, and the people here don't know who I am. So my prayer that morning was, Lord, don't put anybody else in this cell with me. And he didn't. But about 3:30, I was allowed to make my call and had an agent come bail me out. I had to go to court. But to go to court, I was introduced through an undercover judge who was working with us to the prosecutor. And he said, meet me in the police precinct in the courthouse. So on the day of trial, I went to the police precinct, met the prosecutor. He took me to the judge's chambers. The judge was already on the bench, but the prosecutor says, okay, here's the deal. We have paid off the 2 police officers, so they won't be here to testify against you. The judge knows all about the case, and he's going to give you probation for a year and have you go to traffic school, and then your case will be expunged. Is that good enough? I said, no, not good enough. He said, what's wrong with that? I said, I don't want to go to traffic school. He said, okay, you don't have to go to traffic school. I said, okay. And he said, you want to know how much this is going to cost? I said, yeah. He'd been talking freely until then. Of course, I was wearing microphones. So now he goes, I said, $1,200? He said, yeah. He said, do you have that? I said, yes. So I peeled it off. You can hear it on the tape being counted out. And then he said, look, I can't stand up for you because I'm supposed to be prosecuting you. So he said, I've hired a defense attorney. He'll go in, just stand with you. He won't say a word. You won't have to say a word. Everything's taken care of. And it was just like he said. That case went on, folks, for 10 years. And at the end of that case, we indicted 92 people, including 17 judges, 48 lawyers, 10 deputy sheriffs, 8 police officers, 8 court officials, and 1 state legislator. And of the 17 judges indicted, 15 were convicted. What about the judge who heard my case? He killed himself before trial. So he was convicted. Well, after 12 years in Chicago, we went to FBI headquarters, then to Atlanta. I'm running out of time, so I will end with this. I ended my career as the inspector in charge of the task force investigating the Olympic Park bombing and subsequently looking for a man named Eric Rudolph in the mountains of North Carolina. And I think back over my career, and I recall the day I retired, and it was as exciting a day as the first day when I reported to new agents class 28 years before. It was never a job. I loved it. And I think sometimes we misuse Jeremiah 29:11 about, I know the plans I have for you. But I do believe that God has a plan and a purpose. The main purpose for which we're created is to have a relationship with Him. But He goes beyond that because God doesn't create haphazardly. He's a God of order, and He knows what He plans for each one of us. And I take heart from all these years from the 37th Psalm. You need to read it sometime, but just a couple of verses. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in Him, and He will do this. He will make your righteousness shine like the dawn, the justice of your cause like the noonday sun. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for Him. You read through the rest of that psalm and you'll see that if we delight in Him, here's what we will receive. Here's what I have received. Our delights, His peace, His safety, His stability, His provisions, His guidance, His protection, His deliverance, firm footing, a secure future, a refuge, no worry, no poverty, and He will give you the desires of your heart. All I can say is praise God, from whom all blessings flow. He has blessed me immensely, and I can never pay it back. Thank you, folks. I'll turn it back over to the pastor now.